There are albums the world was never supposed to hear. Not because they weren't good enough, not because the artists gave up, but because someone, somewhere inside one of the most powerful music empires ever built, decided to lock them away. And for decades, that's exactly what happened. Tonight, we're opening the vault. 5 legendary Motown albums. Hidden, buried, suppressed. Some shelved mid-production. Some finished, pressed, and then yanked back before they could breathe. Some deliberately erased from the official story. And here's what makes this so haunting. These weren't throwaway sessions. These were albums from artists at the peak of their power. Music that could have changed the entire trajectory of soul. Music that should have been heard 30, 40, 50 years ago. But someone said no. We're going to find out why. Stay with us, because number 2 on this list involves a finished album that Motown not only shelved, they reportedly tried to destroy every copy. And one survived. But we start at number 5. And this one hits different, because the artist never stopped fighting to get it back. Number 5. The year was 1971. Marvin Gaye had just delivered What's Going On, an album so far ahead of its time that Berry Gordy himself called it the worst thing he'd ever heard, before it went on to become the greatest soul album ever recorded. But here's what almost no one talks about. While the world was falling in love with What's Going On, Marvin was already deep in the studio building something else. A project so personal, so spiritually raw, that he refused to let anyone hear it until he felt it was ready. He called it In Our Lifetime, and the story of what Motown did to that album is one of the most disturbing chapters in the label's history. Marvin had been working on it for years, layering it, rethinking it. It was a meditation on God, sexuality, war, and the end of the world. Sounds almost exactly like What's Going On, right? But darker, heavier, less resolved. He wasn't done with it. But in early 1981, while Marvin was out of the country, reports suggest he was in Hawaii, dealing with personal struggles that had followed him for years. Motown made their move. Without his approval, without his final mix, without his blessing of any kind, they pressed the album, changed the title to In Our Lifetime, with a question mark added, and released it. Marvin found out the same way the public did. He heard it on the radio. What he said afterward became legendary in music circles. He told people, quietly and with absolute certainty, that he would never make another record for Motown again. And he never did. The album that exists in the world today is not the album Marvin Gaye made. It's a version, a fragment, a Motown edit of something that was supposed to be a masterpiece, and what the original sounded like, in Marvin's final vision, has never been heard. That's number 5. But if you think that story is painful, stay with us. Because number 4 involves an artist who was told her music was too dangerous to release.
If these stories are speaking to you, there is so much more where this came from. Hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Join the Soul Lens family and never miss a story like this again. Now back to the countdown.
Number 4. If you know Motown history, you know the label had a very specific idea of what their artists should sound like, look like, and talk about. Positive, polished, palatable to white radio. That was the formula. And it worked, enormously. But by the early 1970s, a new generation of Motown artists were pushing back. And nobody pushed harder or paid a higher price than Martha Reeves. Martha Reeves and the Vandellas had given Motown some of its most iconic recordings. Dancing in the Street, Nowhere to Run, Heat Wave. These were not soft songs. They had edge, they had fire, and Martha herself had more fire than almost anyone on the roster. But by 1972, the relationship between Martha and the label had fractured. The album she'd been building, a deeply personal record that dealt with the civil rights movement, her own mental health battles, and the exploitation she felt she'd experienced inside the Motown system, was quietly shelved. Here's what makes this particular case so significant. Martha Reeves was not just a singer. She was a witness. She had been inside Motown from the very beginning, working as a secretary before she ever stepped in front of a microphone. She knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking. She knew what the contracts said. She knew what artists were paid and what they were owed. A record that let Martha Reeves speak freely was a record Motown had every reason to suppress. The sessions existed. People who were in the room at the time have spoken about them over the years. But the tapes? Their current location remains unclear. Whether they're in a private collection, still locked in a Motown archive, or gone entirely, nobody outside a very small circle knows for certain. What we do know is this: Martha Reeves spent years fighting to reclaim her story, and the album that might have told that story in its fullest, most unfiltered form never made it to a single turntable. That's number 4, and I need you to stay with us, because number 3 on this list is going to change the way you think about one of the most beloved voices in soul music history. Number 3. When people talk about the greatest voices Motown ever produced, the conversation usually goes the same way. Marvin, Stevie, Diana, Smokey. And then, a beat later, someone says, David Ruffin, the lead voice of the Temptations. The man behind My Girl Ain't Too Proud to Beg, I Wish It Would Rain. A voice so commanding, so emotionally layered, that even within a group of extraordinary singers, he stood completely apart. Motown knew what they had in David Ruffin, and they used it. But here's what they didn't want. After David was pushed out of the Temptations in 1968, a removal that came amid escalating tensions, demands for co-billing, and behavior the label found increasingly difficult to manage, he launched a solo career. And within that solo career, he began recording something that Motown found profoundly uncomfortable. David Ruffin was making music about what it actually felt like to be David Ruffin. Not the performance, not the showmanship, the real thing. The abandonment he'd felt from his family, the church upbringing that shaped him, the spiritual confusion that came from living inside the contradiction of gospel roots, and a life that had taken him very far from that.
To keep walking out the door.
The way the industry had chewed him up and handed him back to himself in pieces. The album that came from those sessions, raw, intimate, theologically complex in a way that defied easy categorization, was pulled before release. The official explanation at the time involved creative differences and concerns about commercial viability. But people who heard the tapes in that period described it as some of the most honest music David Ruffin ever recorded. He would go on to release other albums, have moments of commercial success, battle addiction for the rest of his life, and die in 1991 in circumstances that remain, to many who loved his music, a tragedy without adequate explanation.
Oh, baby.
The album from those sessions has never been officially released. Fragments of the recordings have circulated, but the full project, in the form David intended, remains locked away. Number 3, and we are not done, because number 2 involves a completed album that Motown reportedly ordered destroyed, and one copy survived. Stay with us. Number 2. This one requires you to understand something about how Motown operated at its peak. Berry Gordy did not run a record label. He ran a machine, a system so tightly controlled, so deliberately engineered from top to bottom, that it functioned more like a corporation than a creative enterprise. Every song was tested, every lyric scrutinized, every public statement managed. That level of control produced extraordinary music. It also produced artists who, eventually, reached their breaking point. Edwin Starr reached his. Edwin Starr is best remembered for War, one of the most visceral anti-war recordings in the history of popular music. A song so blunt, so unambiguous in its fury, that Motown almost didn't release it. They had originally recorded it with the Temptations, but held it back, worried about the political fallout. It took pressure, and Edwin Starr, to push it into the world. War became a #1 hit in 1970, and it changed Edwin Starr's standing inside Motown. But what happened in the years that followed is where the vault story begins. Who wants to die? Edwin Starr had been building an album that went further than war. An album that named names, that drew direct lines between corporate power, political violence, and the music industry itself. Artists who heard early sessions described it as confrontational in a way that made war sound almost gentle by comparison. Motown shelved it. Then, according to multiple accounts from people close to the sessions, Motown went further. The label reportedly moved to destroy the master tapes. Here is what we know for certain. The album was never released. The masters have never appeared in any official Motown archive that has been made public. Edwin Starr himself, in interviews later in his life, spoke carefully and indirectly about recordings that he believed no longer existed, and about his belief that their disappearance was not accidental. But here is the part that changes everything. There are collectors, serious, credentialed collectors who have spent decades inside the world of rare soul recordings, who believe one copy survived. Not a master, a reference pressing, a single disc that made it out of the building before the order came down. Whether that disc has ever been heard by anyone outside a very small and secretive circle of collectors, no one is saying. What we do know is that Edwin Starr spent the rest of his career making music largely outside the Motown system. He moved to England. He rebuilt. He became a beloved figure in British soul and funk scenes. He died in 2003, and the album that may have been the most important thing he ever made may or may not still exist somewhere. That's number 2. And before we get to number 1, the album on this list that involves an artist who was actively performing some of this music live to sold-out audiences while the label refused to release it, I want to take a second to acknowledge something. You have stayed with us through 5 stories of music that was deliberately taken from the world. That's not an accident. You feel what's at stake here. You understand that this isn't just music history. It's a record of power, control, and what gets silenced, and why. Number 1 is the most significant story on this list, and it starts with a question. What do you do when your music is too true for the label to contain? Number 1. Her name was Syreeta Wright, and if that name doesn't stop you cold, it should. Syreeta Wright was not a peripheral figure in Motown history. She was married to Stevie Wonder. She co-wrote some of the most significant material of his early 1970s creative period. She was signed to the label as a solo artist, recorded with some of the most gifted producers in the building, and released music that, even in its released form, represented some of the most sophisticated soul recordings of that era. But there was an album, built in the years following her separation from Stevie, during a period of profound personal reinvention, that Motown never released. The circumstances around that album are complicated in a specific way that makes it different from every other story on this list, because Syreeta was performing songs from it live. There are documented accounts, from people who attended her performances during this period, of songs that were clearly finished, clearly arranged, clearly ready for recording, that simply never appeared on any official release. Songs that dealt with the dissolution of her marriage in language that was explicit without being sensational. Songs that explored what it meant to have your identity entangled with someone else's genius, and then have to excavate yourself from that. The Motown machine was not built for that conversation. There were also industry dynamics at play that went beyond the purely creative. By the mid-1970s, Motown was changing. The label was shifting its focus. Artists who didn't fit the new commercial direction found their projects deprioritized, delayed, and eventually abandoned. Syreeta's unreleased album, the full version, in the form she intended, has never emerged. What has emerged over the years are bootleg recordings of her live performances. Audience captures, mostly. Low quality, but enough to hear what the songs were. Enough to understand what was lost. Syreeta Wright continued to record and perform for decades. She collaborated, she contributed, she was loved by everyone who knew her work with genuine depth. She died in 2004, and the album that might have been the most personal thing she ever made exists, if it exists at all, somewhere inside an archive that has never been opened to the public.